Dunfield Estate Auctions, Elgin County, Ontario. A Thursday in November, the kind that comes with low cloud and the smell of wet leaves that haven't been raked yet. C.O. Aldridge stood at the back of the room with his hands in the front pocket of his work jacket, watching the auctioneer move through lot after lot without any urgency. He'd driven 2 hours from Kincardine for this. He'd told his daughter he was going to look at a table. The table had already sold. He stayed anyway, because lot 22 was still on the floor, pushed against the far wall between a broken floor lamp and 3 boxes of Reader's Digest condensed books. Nobody had gone near it. The estate tag on the side said piano, as is in black marker, and the as is part had done its work. A man in a green vest had opened the lid, pressed 2 keys, heard the dull thunk of dead strings, and walked away without writing anything down. C.O. didn't go near it either, not yet. He walked the room the long way, looking at other lots, stopping at things he had no interest in, the way you do when you don't want anyone to know what you're actually there for. When he finally crouched beside the piano, he did it slowly, as though his back was giving him trouble, which it was, but that wasn't why he was moving carefully. He pressed his palm flat against the side panel, just below the fallboard hinge, and held it there. Then he took out his phone and used the flashlight to look into the gap between the lid brace and the rear frame. He stayed like that for about 40 seconds. He stood up and dusted his hands on his jeans. Across the room, a woman named Claire Sutherland was watching him from behind her lot sheet. She ran the estate coordination for Dunfield. Not the auctioneer, not the cataloger, the person who came in after a family called and sorted out what was left when someone was gone. She'd been doing it for 11 years, and she'd learned that the people who crouched beside things were almost always more interesting than the people who didn't. She made a small note next to lot 22, watcher, back left. She went back to her clipboard. 3 days before that Thursday, Theo had been at his kitchen table in Kincardine when an email came through from the Dunfield mailing list. He subscribed to 6 regional estate auction services across Bruce and Huron counties, mostly for furniture and tools, the bread and butter stuff his small restoration shop could turn around without too much risk. He almost didn't open this one. The photograph in the listing was bad, taken at an angle, poorly lit, and whoever had taken it had included their own shadow in the bottom third of the frame. What it showed was an upright piano, dark walnut case, probably late 19th century, no maker's plate visible. Theo had been about to close the tab. The leg detail in the lower right corner made him stop. He pinched the photo open on his screen and zoomed in until the image blurred, then backed out 1 notch. The turning on the front legs wasn't decorative in the way that mass-produced instruments were decorative. Regular intervals, consistent radius. The kind of thing a production lathe made efficiently and without variation. This was irregular. The taper was hand-shaped. The groove spacing changed by a centimeter every 3 turns. A pattern he'd seen before. A very specific before, in a photograph in a book he'd kept on his shelf since he was 24. He got up from the table and went to the shelf. The book was there. He found the page. He stood in his kitchen at 10:30 at night comparing a photograph and a 40-year-old reference text to a blurred image on his phone screen, and after a long time he set both down on the counter and stood there with his arms crossed, running the math in his head. He called his neighbor, Wendy Pedersen, in the morning and asked if she could take Finn to school Thursday. Finn was 8. He'd spent most of the last 2 years asking careful, thorough questions about everything: why roads curved, how old trees knew to grow upward, whether the moon was the same moon everywhere. He asked these questions the way some people do arithmetic, methodically, without apparent urgency, expecting an accurate answer. He'd gotten that from his father. Wednesday evening, Theo picked him up from after-school care, and Finn sat at the kitchen table eating crackers and looking at the Dunfield catalog Theo had printed. "Why are you going to look at a piano?" Finn said. "You don't play." "I know what they're worth." Finn considered this with the solemnity of someone taking the idea seriously. "Is this one worth something?" "It might be." "How much?" "Depends what it turns out to be." Finn ate another cracker and looked at the photograph for a moment. "It looks like our neighbor's shed," he said. "That's the point," Theo said. "Things that look like sheds sometimes aren't." Finn appeared to accept this as a reasonable explanation for adult behavior. He slid the catalog back across the table and went to find his backpack. At the preview Thursday morning, Theo had spent 20 minutes on Lot 22. The nameplate was missing, removed at some point, cleanly, not torn. That was significant in itself. Someone had known the plate was there and decided to take it. Whether they'd sold it separately, or kept it, or lost it over 70 years of the instrument sitting in someone's front room, he couldn't know. But the caseword told the story the plate didn't need to finish. The secondary wood inside the fall, visible only when you opened the lid at a specific angle under the right light, Quebec yellow birch, a very particular cut, quarter sawn, with a grain pattern that only one workshop in the country had used consistently during a specific decade. He'd read about it once in a conservation report from the Royal Ontario Museum. He'd dismissed it as trivia at the time and then spent the next 3 years not being able to stop thinking about it. He stood up from the floor beside the piano, and a man behind him said something to the woman next to him that made her laugh, and Theo didn't turn around. He walked to the registration table and gave his name. When Lot 22 came up, the opening bid was set at $75. The room was largely quiet. People were between lots, checking their phones, getting coffee from the table by the door. The auctioneer called for a bid twice. Theo raised his number. There was a pause. Someone at the front said something Theo couldn't hear, and 2 or 3 people around the speaker laughed. A man named Kent Hadley, who ran the largest antique dealership in the county and had been buying furniture from Dunfield for 15 years, turned around and looked at Theo with an expression that was not unkind, but was definitely amused. "What's the plan?" Kent said, not loudly, but not quietly. "Kindling?" Theo looked at the piano. No other bids came in. The gavel came down. Claire, standing at the side of the room, watched Theo walk forward to initial the receipt. She watched him do the math on the paperwork quickly, efficiently, the way someone does when they already know all the numbers. She watched his face, which gave nothing. She wrote his name again on her sheet and underlined it once. Theo got the piano home on a borrowed flatbed with help from his friend Warren Desjardins, who drove up from Port Elgin and asked no questions during the loading and only one on the drive back. "How bad is it?" "Case is sound, interior's a mess." "You knew that going in?" "Yes." Warren nodded, which was the end of the conversation. They were friends the way certain men are, useful to each other, comfortable with silence, uninterested in performing. Theo's shop was in the back half of a double garage on his property, separated from the house by a covered walkway he'd built himself the first winter after Julia died. It gave him somewhere to go at 11 at night without waking Finn. And it gave him something to do with his hands during a season that had otherwise been mostly about getting through the next morning. He'd been running the restoration side of things for 6 years. Furniture mostly, some architectural woodwork, the occasional instrument. He had a reputation in the county for being thorough and slow, which in this business was a compliment. The piano came off the flatbed and into the shop on a furniture dolly, and Warren helped him get it settled and then stood back and looked at it in the shop light. "Does it play?" "Not right now." "Will it?" Theo ran his hand along the top of the case. "That's not the question." Warren looked at him and seemed to decide that this was sufficient and went home. That evening, a woman named Gwen Fairweather arrived at her desk in the Dunfield office on Talbot Street with a cup of coffee and an unusual amount of curiosity about a piano that had sold for $75. Gwen worked alongside Claire on estate coordination. She handled the documentation side, provenance research when families had it, insurance estimates, that kind of work. Claire had left a note on Gwen's desk. The note said, "Lot 22. Buyer, Aldridge, T. Kincardine. Look into the Dunmore estate background when you get a chance." Gwen looked at the note for a moment. Then she pulled the Dunmore file. The piano had come from the house of a woman named Iris Dunmore, 89, who had died in September. No children, no direct heirs. The estate had gone to a niece in Halifax who'd never visited the house and had hired Dunfield to clear it. The piano had been in the front room for as long as any neighbor could remember. Iris had played it, apparently, until she couldn't. No one knew where it had come from originally. The niece hadn't asked. Gwen typed the description into a reference database she subscribes to through a heritage conservation network. She narrowed by region, by decade, by construction method. One workshop came back as a potential match. She closed the laptop and looked at what she'd written and sat with it for several minutes. The first week was demolition and assessment. Theo removed the action assembly in sections, careful, numbering each piece before it came out, laying everything on a work table covered with brown paper. The strings were dead, corroded through in several places, irreparable. The hammers needed complete regrinding or replacement. Most of the dampers were either missing or had lost their felt entirely. The pin block had cracks in it that meant the whole plate had to come out before he could evaluate whether the block could be saved. It could not. He made a list on a piece of paper and taped it to the wall above the workbench. Below the list, he wrote a number. His estimate of what the instrument was actually worth, if he was right about what it was. Below that, he wrote another number, what the job would cost him in materials and time if he was wrong. The gap between them was either going to be the best decision he'd ever made or a very thorough explanation of why he had no savings. Finn came to the shop after school on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He'd drop his bag on the old stool by the door, look at whatever was on the workbench for a few seconds, and then pull out his homework. He didn't interrupt, which Theo appreciated in the way you appreciate things that feel like small miracles. But after 20 minutes or so, he'd ask something. One Thursday, about a week in, is a piano a string instrument? Theo was at the bench with a jeweler's loop, looking at a piece of the original pin block. Yes. Then how come it's not called a string instrument? It is, technically. Finn thought about this. People say it's a piano, though. Keyboard instrument, it's both. Finn was quiet for a moment, doing something with his pencil, like how a bat is a mammal but we don't call it a mammal. Theo looked up from the loop. Exactly like that. Finn seemed satisfied. He went back to his homework. On the 9th day, a car Theo didn't recognize pulled into the drive and a man came to the shop door with a card that said Whitmore and Associates, Estate Acquisitions. His name was apparently Ferris. He was wearing a very clean jacket for a shop visit, and he smelled like the kind of cologne that came in heavy bottles. He explained that his client had an interest in the piano from the Dunmore estate and wanted to make a private offer before Theo went through the trouble of a full restoration. Theo said it wasn't for sale. Ferris said his client was prepared to be generous given the as-is condition, and he'd save Theo the cost of materials and the uncertainty of any future sale. Theo said it wasn't for sale. Ferris looked around the shop with the eyes of someone trying to figure out what he was looking at, then looked at the piano, which was covered with a canvas dropcloth, every edge of it hidden. He left. Theo stood in the door of the shop and watched the car go down the road and turn at the end of the lane and disappear into the grayness of November. He didn't know who the client was yet. He would find out. That evening, Claire got a call on her work cell from a man named Hadley, Kent Hadley, the same man who'd made the comment about kindling at the auction. He was friendly about it. He explained that he had a buyer, private collector, serious, not local, who'd expressed interest in a late 19th century upright from a Elgin County estate, and he wanted to know if Claire could share any documentation from the original Dunmore file, insurance records, provenance notes, anything the estate had disclosed. Claire said the file was internal and she wasn't able to share it. Kent mentioned that Whitmore and Associates were good clients of Dunfield's and that they'd worked together on several significant transactions. Claire said she'd heard him and that she'd answered his question, and she had another call waiting. She did not have another call waiting. She sat at her desk for a few minutes after she ended the call. She hadn't told Theo about the inquiry yet. She was thinking about whether she should, and if she did, what exactly she would say, and whether she had a reason beyond the one she wasn't quite ready to name. She pulled up the contact form from the Dunfield website, found the phone number for the Kincardine shop, and saved it to her phone under a name that was just Aldridge, Lot 22. On day 14, she drove out to Kincardine. She told herself she was in the area for another estate visit, which was true, though the estate was in the other direction. She parked on the road in front of the property and walked to the shop. And when Theo looked up from the bench, he looked at her and then past her at the car on the road, and then back at her with an expression that said he'd already done the math. She said she was following up on lot documentation. Dunfield liked to track the disposition of specialty pieces. It helped with their pricing. He opened the door wider and she came in. The piano was partially disassembled on the bench and on a work table beside it. The case was open, the action removed, the internal woodwork exposed. Claire looked at it and didn't look at it the way someone who didn't know what they were looking at would look at it. She looked at the secondary wood on the inside of the fall. She was quiet for a moment. Quarter sawn birch, Theo said, without her asking. She turned and looked at him. Quebec cut, he said. You already know that. She did, but she hadn't expected him to say it quite that directly. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the case. Do you have documentation? Not yet, working on it. She walked around the instrument slowly. There's a heritage conservation database that came back with one workshop, she said, more to the case than to him. Boutique maker. Quebec City. Operated from 1887 to 1931. Maybe 40 instruments documented. Most in institutions. 43 documented, Theo said. 12 in private hands. This would be 13. She looked at him. How long have you been sitting on that? Since the preview. She didn't have an answer ready for that. She wrote something on her clipboard that she didn't show him. When she left, she stood outside the shop door for a moment before getting to her car. She could hear him working in there, the sound of something precise being fitted into something else, the patience of it. She got in the car and drove toward the road and wasn't quite paying attention to where she was going yet. The middle weeks were the hardest. Theo ordered a new pin block from a specialty supplier in Montreal that cost more than he told Warren and took 11 days to arrive. He sourced strings from a piano technician in Hamilton who had old stock in a workshop that was closing. He drove to Guelph on a Wednesday evening for a set of replacement hammers from a restoration shop that was retiring its principals and didn't need them anymore, and he drove back in the dark and ate a gas station sandwich somewhere past Guelph and didn't think about the cost. He thought about provenance instead. He could restore the instrument perfectly, get everything right, every piece historically appropriate, the tone as close to original as was possible, and none of that would matter without a paper trail that someone with credentials could stand behind. The casework was evidence, but evidence needed a witness. On day 21, Finn was at his grandmother's in Walkerton, and the shop was quiet, the way it only got when it was just Theo in the wood and the cold outside the walls. He sat on the floor with his back against the piano case and looked at the ceiling. Not stuck, more like accounting, running the columns. On the bench above him there was a photograph he'd moved from the house to the shop sometime in the first year after Julia. It wasn't in a prominent spot, tucked between a reference manual and a tin of finish brushes. Julia standing beside a refinished secretary desk at a client delivery, autumn 2019, squinting against the light in the way she did when she didn't want to close her eyes. But the sun was in the wrong place. She had her hand on the desk's drop leaf, the way she put her hand on things she found beautiful, flat, unhurried, like she was making sure it knew it was being appreciated. She had been the one who told him to stay in Kincardine when the offer came from a firm in Toronto. A good offer. The kind that comes with a relocation package and a title and a parking spot with your name on it. This is where Finn is from, she'd said. That mattered to her in a way Theo had learned not to argue with, because she was usually right about things that mattered. She'd been diagnosed in the spring of 2021. She died in February 2022. He hadn't taken any offers since. His phone on the bench buzzed. 10,017. A message from Claire checking whether the Dunfield title transfer documentation had cleared properly. A routine question, the kind that could have waited until morning. He looked at the message for a moment. It was a reasonable question. It was also a question that didn't need to be asked at 10:17 on a Tuesday. He wrote back that the documentation had cleared and that the work was on schedule. Nobody had asked about the schedule. 3 minutes later, her response came back. I know. He set the phone face down on the floor beside him and looked at the ceiling for a while after that. Day 26. A woman Theo had met twice. Dr. Paulette Ossino, an instrument conservator out of Ottawa who had done assessment work for the National Art Centre and the Canadian Museum of History, came to the shop on a referral Theo had arranged through a former colleague. She spent 40 minutes with the instrument and its documentation. She handled the secondary woodwork with the care of someone who had handled a lot of things that mattered and knew the difference. She asked Theo questions he answered in full, and she asked him questions he answered only in part, and she seemed to understand without being told why the second category was smaller. When she left, she said she could write a condition report and a preliminary identification assessment within 2 weeks. She said preliminary because she was professional, and because she was honest, and because she was not going to put her name on something she couldn't stand behind. She said it might be enough. Theo said it was more than enough. That evening, Claire received a package at the Dunfield office. No sender information on the outside, just the Dunfield address and printed label. Inside, a photocopy of a workshop ledger, handwritten, dated entries from 1902 through 1909, 12 pages. In a margin of page 8, a lot reference number, an instrument type, upright, walnut, 88 keys, a delivery address in the Elgin County region of Ontario, and an invoice total in period currency. The handwriting matched a sample she'd seen in a Heritage Archive photograph 6 days earlier, when she'd been doing her own research into the workshop. She sat at her desk with it for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called Theo. He answered on the second ring. "I was going to call you tomorrow," he said. "I know," she said. "I got here first." She told him what was in the package. She read the lot description out loud, slowly, the way you read something when you want to make sure you're reading it and not inventing it. When she finished, there was a pause on the line. "Where did it come from?" he said. "I don't know yet. I'm going to find out." Another pause. "Don't do anything that causes you problems with the auction house." "That's my call to make." He was quiet for a moment. "All right." It was the first time he'd asked about her instead of the piano. She noticed it and didn't say anything about it, but she noticed it. She tracked the package to a retired archivist in London, Ontario, who declined to give his name but confirmed by email that the document was authentic to the best of his assessment and that he'd been sitting on it for 12 years and felt it was time for it to go somewhere useful. He said he had no interest in being contacted further. He said, "Good luck with what you're building." Claire forwarded the email to Theo. He sent back 2 words, "Thank you." She stared at her screen for a moment, then went home. Day 29. The piano was done. Theo stood at the far end of the shop and looked at it. The casework cleaned and polished to the original walnut tone, not stripped and refinished, which would have been wrong, cleaned, carefully, over 4 days, until the original surface came through the way it had been under 70 years of household air and neglect, and someone's good intentions. The new strings set and tuned. The action rebuilt, not original parts throughout, that had been impossible, but period-appropriate materials, sourced correctly, fitted with the patience that the work required. The keys were covered in bone, not plastic, which mattered, and the fallboard polished to a depth that changed depending on how the light hit it, dark and warm and, if you were standing in the right place, almost liquid. Warren was there. He'd driven up with sandwiches again and hadn't left. He sat on the stool by the parts counter and looked at the instrument for a long time. Then, "Does it play?" Theo walked to the bench, sat down and played a C major scale, slowly, in both hands. The tone came out of the instrument the way tone comes out of old wood when the wood has been given back what it was, round and warm and settled, without the edgy brightness of new instruments or the dead compression of neglected ones. Like something finding the frequency it was built for. Warren sat very still. Then he said quietly, "Okay." "There are 5 instruments in institutions," Theo said. "One at the ROM, one at the McCord in Montreal, one in a private collection in Nova Scotia that hasn't been heard in 20 years. And now one in your shop in Kincardine. And now one in my shop in Kincardine." Warren stood up and looked at it for another moment. "What does Finn think?" "Haven't played it for him yet." "Why not?" Theo looked at the piano. "Wanted to play it alone first." Warren picked up his coat and didn't say anything, which was the right answer. At 9 that evening, Claire called. She'd spent the better part of 2 weeks working through it. The ledger document, Dr. Arsenault's assessment, a provenance package she'd assembled with a degree of care she didn't usually apply to lots in Dunfield's price bracket. The package was not conclusive. It was legitimate. It disclosed everything, presented the evidence clearly, acknowledged the gaps honestly. She told him she was prepared to list it with full transparency, claimed workshop provenance, supported by ledger documentation and independent condition assessment, disclosed per Dunfield's buyer transparency policy. Theo listened. When she finished, he said, "Will Hadley make trouble for you?" A pause. "Probably, that's my problem." 40 minutes later, a car came up the drive. Theo opened the shop door and found Kent Hadley standing in the yard in a wax canvas jacket, looking uncomfortable in the way men do when they've decided to do something they know is at least slightly wrong but have rationalized it far enough that they're going ahead anyway. He asked whether Theo had considered a private transaction. He explained the advantages: no commission, no uncertainty, cash on the table tonight, clean and simple. His client was serious and motivated, and the number would be fair. Theo said, "You called the piano kindling 4 weeks ago." Kent said that was before he'd done his research. Theo said, "I know." Kent named a number. Theo said the instrument wasn't for sale. Kent named a higher number. Theo said, "You had the same opportunity I did. You were in the same room." Kent stopped. He looked at the shop, at the light coming through the windows, at the shape of the piano visible through the glass. His face did something complicated. "You knew before you walked in," Kent said. "I had a strong suspicion." From a catalog photograph. From a leg detail in a catalog photograph. Kent studied him for a moment. Then he nodded, once, slowly, and walked back to his car. He didn't look back. Theo closed the door. He stood in the quiet for a moment. From the corner of the shop, where the old cot was set up because Finn's grandmother had a standing Thursday card game and Finn had needed somewhere to sleep this week, came a small sound. "Dad." Theo crossed the shop. Finn was sitting up on the cot with his blanket bunched in his lap, looking at the piano with the drowsy, thorough focus of a child who has been mostly asleep and woken up for something he's decided matters. "That's the one," Finn said. "That's the one." Finn looked at it seriously. He had a way of considering things that involved going very still, like the thinking required physical stillness to work properly. "Can it play now?" "Yes." "Will you play it?" "In the morning." Finn appeared to find this acceptable. He leaned against Theo's shoulder and was asleep again inside a minute. Theo sat on the edge of the cot and didn't move for a while. Later, when the shop was quiet, he walked to the piano and sat down at the bench and put his hands on the keys, not playing, just holding them there. He looked through the window at the dark outside, the yard, the covered walkway back to the house, the light Finn had left on in his bedroom. He didn't play. He sat there. Sawdust unwinding. The Dunfield auction house on Talbot Street was full in a way it usually wasn't for a Thursday county estate sale crowd. People had come from London, from Stratford, from a private collector in Kitchener, whose paddle was already out and whose associate was on a phone call in the parking lot. 2 men Theo didn't recognize had come in together and stood near the front, talking in the specific low tone of people who have already decided what they're willing to spend and are reviewing the arithmetic. Claire had listed the instrument 3 days prior with a full write-up. Workshop provenance consistent with documented Quebec City maker 1887 to 1931. Supporting documentation, period ledger entry, independent condition and identification assessment by accredited conservator, photographic casework analysis. All evidence disclosed. All gaps disclosed. Dunfield buyer transparency policy applied. She had included high-resolution photographs of the secondary wood, the leg detail, the internal casework, and the document. She had included Dr. Arsenault's assessment with the conservator's specific language intact. She had not softened the hedging, and she had not inflated the certainty, because the document was worth more honest than it was worth polished. Kent Hadley had called the office twice that week. She hadn't returned either call. The piano was brought to the floor at 10:40, moved on a felt dolly by 2 of Dunfield's staff who had been briefed extensively on what not to bump. The room went quiet when it came through. Not the polite shuffling quiet between lots, but a real quiet. The kind that settles when a room is looking at the same thing and has decided it's worth looking at. The walnut case under the auction room lights. The restored fallboard. The depth of the surface. Dark and warm and varying as you moved your angle. Sorrowful people in the front row leaned forward without appearing to decide to. Claire called the opening bid at $14,000. 5 paddles went up immediately. In 8 minutes, the room was at $62,000 and narrowing. By 11 minutes, it was Kent Hadley's client, a number on a card, bidding by phone through Hadley, and the man from Kitchener who had come with the associate. They went back and forth without visible emotion, the way people do when they've already cleared the ceiling. They came in with and are now spending their way into a decision they'll have to explain later. 91. 98, 104, 112. Kent's client paused at 112. Claire looked at the room. She found Theo at the back. Same spot as 4 weeks ago. Back wall, hands in his jacket pocket, watching the piano. He hadn't bid. He'd consigned the instrument to Dunfield 2 days before the sale and stepped entirely out of the process. He was just watching. 117 from Kitchener. Kent's phone line was silent. Claire gave the room 10 seconds. 117,000, going once. A pause, going twice. She brought the gavel down. The room moved, not applause exactly, more the sound of people exhaling at the same time, which is a kind of applause. Kent Hadley, near the front, rose from his seat, said something brief into his phone, and walked toward the exit. Not fast. Measured. The walk of a man who is deciding, mid-step, what he's learned today and what he intends to do with it. Claire wrote the number on her sheet and signed her name. She looked up. Theo was looking at her from across the room, not smiling, just looking with the particular steadiness of someone who has done what they set out to do and is not going to perform it. She held it for a moment, then looked back down at her paperwork and was aware, without being able to say exactly when it had started, that she was paying attention in a way she hadn't paid attention to anything in a long time. The room thinned over the next half hour. Theo signed the settlement sheet at the side table. After commission and fees, the number that cleared was enough to cover everything: materials, the specialist visits, the parts from Montreal and Hamilton and Guelph, the sandwiches Warren kept bringing, and leave a remainder that was more than Theo had let himself expect. He stood in the hallway looking at the figure on the form and let out a long, slow breath. Not at the money, at the fact that what he'd seen in a poor-quality photograph on a mailing list, the thing he'd driven 2 hours to look at and crouched on a cold floor beside and driven back in the dark, had been real. That seeing it had mattered, that the 30 days of work had been exactly what the work required. Kent found him in the hall a few minutes later. He stopped in front of Theo and looked at him the way a man does when he is recalibrating something he'd had settled. "From a catalog photograph," Kent said. "The leg detail," Theo said. Kent looked down the hallway toward the now empty floor, then back. "I've been buying from this region for 18 years. I've walked past that kind of thing 100 times. Theo didn't say anything. "What were you looking for, specifically?" Kent said. "I wasn't looking for anything. I recognized something." Kent held his gaze. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man filing something away. He walked on without offering his hand, which Theo thought was at least honest. Claire found him near the side door a few minutes later. She had the settlement envelope and the formal closeout papers, and she handed them over and he took them. "You didn't tell me about the ledger document," she said, "when I first asked about the piano." "You didn't ask about the document. You asked about the piano." "I searched your name," she said. "I know." She paused. "When did you know?" He said it plainly. "When you came to the shop the first time and asked about the secondary wood, you used the term quarter-sawn without hesitating. That's not a term someone uses without having done the reading first." She looked at him. It was a specific kind of look, the expression of someone who was used to being the one ahead encountering a person who had been tracking her the whole time and hadn't mentioned it. "I thought I had the advantage," she said. "You did," he said. "You found the ledger." She didn't have a quick answer ready for that. That was unusual. The main door opened, and Finn came in from the parking lot, moving at the half-run of a child who has been sitting in a car for 20 minutes and has decided they've waited long enough. Wendy Pedersen followed him in, still pulling on her gloves. Finn made a direct line for his father. "How much?" "Enough. Enough." Finn narrowed his eyes with the precision of someone who had inherited a low tolerance for vague answers. "Enough for what?" "New skates, and the garage roof." Finn thought about this for a moment, testing it against some internal standard. It appeared to pass. He looked at Claire with the frank, uncomplicated assessment of a child who has no reason to be anything other than direct. "You ran the auction." "I held the gavel, yes." Finn thought about that. That's the most important part. Theo looked at her, and this time, without anything held back, he smiled. 2 weeks later, the shop in Kincardine had a different instrument on the bench. A 1940s upright from an estate in Goderich. This one, a genuine wreck, with no hidden history and no surprises. A bread-and-butter job that would take 6 weeks and turn a modest profit and pay for 2 months of parts orders. Theo was under the key frame with a flashlight when he heard Warren's truck in the drive. Warren came in and sat on the stool and said without preamble, "I heard from someone at the Conservators Network. There's talk of a commission." Theo kept working. "What kind?" "A private family. Quebec City. They think they have another piece from the same workshop. They want someone who knows what they're looking at." Theo was quiet for a moment. "Who referred them?" "Arsenault." He came out from under the frame and sat up and looked at the ceiling. Warren had a talent for leaving space in a conversation, and he left it now. Theo was still sitting on the floor when he heard a car on the gravel. It wasn't Warren's. He knew Warren's truck. He also, it turned out, knew this car. He heard the door and then footsteps on concrete, and Claire came into the shop without knocking, which she had apparently decided was no longer necessary. She had nothing in her hands, no clipboard, no bag, no prop of any kind. She stood in the middle of the shop in her coat and looked at him sitting on the floor next to the workbench. "Arsenault called the office," she said, "to confirm documentation for the conservator registry. She mentioned a commission inquiry. Warren just told me. And he got to his feet, and I'm thinking about it." She watched him. "She mentioned that whoever takes it should probably have someone with provenance documentation experience on the research side." A pause. "She mentioned that?" "She asked me if I'd be interested, before she asked you." Claire held his gaze with the steadiness of someone who has done a thing carefully and is not going to look away from it now. "I said I'd ask." The shop was quiet, not the taut quiet of two people at different points on a question, the quiet of two people who have arrived at the same place from different directions and are now standing in it at the same moment. "The Goderich piece will take 6 weeks, Theo said. "I'd need to clear it first." "I know," Claire said. "I'm not in a hurry." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached past her and opened the shop door a little wider. Not a gesture of invitation, just the thing you do when you want more light in a room, or when you want to make sure the way in stays open. Claire looked at the instrument on the bench. "What did they use on the 1940s cases?" "Depends on the maker. This one's lacquer over birch. Harder to read than walnut." "Everything's harder to read until you know what to look for." She turned to look at him, and the afternoon light came through the open door at the low angle. November light has in Ontario, flat and honest and without any warmth to spare, and it laid their two shadows across the concrete floor of the shop, side by side, longer than they had any right to be. Neither of them had been looking for this, but it was here, and they both knew it, and that, as it turned out, was enough. I keep thinking about the moment Theo crouched on that cold auction floor with a flashlight, looking at a leg detail nobody else had stopped to look at. The room was moving around him. People had coffee. People had other lots to get to, and he stayed down there, quiet, doing the thing he'd spent his whole working life learning how to do, reading wood the way some people read faces. That's not luck. That's what happens when someone has spent years building something real inside themselves, even when the world around them wasn't paying attention. I think about what it takes to see what Theo saw in that catalog photograph. It wasn't a flash of inspiration. It was pattern recognition, built from decades of honest work. The kind that doesn't come with a shortcut. He'd put in the years at Callaway. He'd left when it mattered more to go home than to stay. He'd kept working in a converted garage in Kincardine, while the rest of the world drove past the sign without reading it. All of that, every decision, every choice that looked like a step back, added up to a man who could look at a blurry image of a piano leg and know exactly what he was looking at. There's something that I find genuinely settling. The idea that what you put into yourself honestly, without performing it for anyone, doesn't disappear. It stays. It compounds. And at some point, sometimes on a Thursday morning in November in a room that's already moved on, it becomes visible. Theo didn't go to that auction to prove anything to Kent Hadley. He didn't buy the piano to win. He bought it because he recognized something true, and he had enough integrity in his own judgment to act on it quietly, without needing anyone else to confirm it first. That takes a kind of inner steadiness that I think most of us are still working on. I know I am. And then there's the 30 days. That's the part that gets to me most. The sourcing trips to Hamilton and Guelph in the dark. The pin block for Montreal that cost more than he'd said out loud. Eating a gas station sandwich past Guelph and just continuing. Not because anyone was watching, not because it was easy, because the work required it and he'd decided the work was worth doing. That's not stubbornness. That's the particular kind of strength that shows up after loss. When you've already survived the thing you thought would break you and you found out, quietly, that you're still here. Finn helped with that. The way an 8-year-old who asks good questions and falls asleep on a cot in a piano shop will. The way kids do. Reminding you that the reason to keep going is standing right there in front of you finishing a granola bar, asking whether a piano is a string instrument. What Thea built in those 30 days wasn't just an instrument. It was proof, to himself, mostly, that what he knew was real. That leaving Columbus had been right. That the years in the garage had been worth it. And Claire, who had done her own quiet work in parallel, who had tracked down a ledger entry in a package with no return address, who had shown up to the shop without a clipboard, she understood that, because she'd been doing her own version of the same thing. I don't think either of them was looking for what they found. But that's usually how it goes. You put in the honest work. You act on what you actually know. You show up to the cold room with a flashlight and you stay low, and you look carefully. And sometimes, on the other side of 30 days, the gavel comes down and the room goes quiet, and what was always true becomes visible to everyone. That's the only alchemy I've ever believed in.